Hi everybody, my name is Julian Reyes. I'm the lead producer for Fusion for VR, and I'm also leading the efforts here on the Mars 2030 project that we're about to talk about. A little bit about Fusion. We're a multi-platform media company. We do all sorts of different, we're on all sorts of different mediums from Snapchat to VR. We're especially excited about VR because of its opportunities and everything that comes along with it, especially in storytelling. And yeah, so we're here to talk a little bit about the project and kind of show you guys. So I want to kind of introduce everybody here and let them introduce themselves. This is our team that's been kind of part of this whole project and letting us put this all together. You guys want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, my name's Sydney Doe. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics at MIT. I do research in space habitation and life support, and I've been playing the technical advisor for this project.
My name's Pat Troutman. I work at the NASA Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. My job is to herd cats and figure out how humans are going to go explore space beyond where we are now at the International Space Station.
I'm Tzvig Winstein. I'm a general manager at the GeForce Group at Nvidia. I'm also heading the business development for VR. First time for me at South by Southwest. Love Austin. Excited to be here. Very passionate about VR.
I'm Justin Sonikelb. I'm a freelance technical designer, formerly from Irrational Games, where I worked on Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite.
So this whole project started with one question, which was, where are we today on a mission to Mars? And it kind of evolved from a whole bunch of different conversations that we've had with all of the groups of people here on the stage today. And it's evolved to something that we're really excited to kind of put together and construct for an interactive experience. And this actually all started with a conversation with Sydney and his work at MIT based on the feasibility of habitation and to get to Mars. And basically, it evolved to a conversation with NASA and to be able to kind of put this all together. And what we were aiming to do is it's something I find really interesting, which is there's an intersection here in this project where we wanted to get the latest in research that NASA had on a mission to Mars, and then combine it, since we're all video gamers ourselves and we work with video game engines, we wanted to grab all that research and integrate it inside of this experience. And then also kind of create the most visually accurate rendering of Mars. And so all of these people on this panel today have all kind of contributed to kind of putting this all together, and it's been really fun for us. And I'll let them kind of dive into each one of these, but yeah, just so.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of human spaceflight, give you a really brief overview, talk about the research that we're doing at MIT, and kind of how the outputs of this research have been fed into some of the content you see in the VR experience. So one of the goals of this Mars 2030 VR experience was to kind of represent the state of the art and the research in the technologies and the operational concepts about how we're going to land people on Mars and sustain them there. So I just first want to start by going back in time to 1969. So this picture is of Buzz Aldrin stepping down the ladder of the Apollo lunar module. It's taken by Neil Armstrong on the surface of the moon. And this is the culmination of over a decade's worth of work of 400,000 people across this country who worked towards the goal of landing humans on the surface of the moon. What many people don't know is that in the decades prior to this, there was a coordinated effort across multiple disparate organizations across the US to both perform the fundamental research that would allow us to develop the technologies to enable us to get here, and also to develop experiences, media experiences, that would enable the public to join along in the adventure of human spaceflight. And so human spaceflight has been a common thread, and a lot of the predecessors of the organizations that are represented on this panel have their lineage back to the pre-Apollo period. So Disney, for example, is the parent company, one of the parent companies of Fusion TV. And back in the 1950s, Walt Disney led the production of a number of animated shorts, one of which is shown here, Man in Space, explaining to the public the difficulties of sending humans in space, what would happen to the human body if you didn't have a spacesuit on, the concepts of action and reaction, which is fundamental to how rockets move within space. And it typically start off these shorts by introducing the content himself. And that's a photo of him down there, from his own desk, where he would talk through his model aircraft and spacecraft. At the time, the leading rocket engineer at NASA, Werner von Braun, actually collaborated directly with Walt Disney, provided the technical content for what you see here, and he even featured in some of the shots. So on the top image there, he's introducing the concept of a manned space station in low Earth orbit. On the bottom right, the black and white image, he's being shown around Marshall Space Flight Center of the rocket stages that Dr. Werner von Braun was the lead of, so the Saturn V rocket there. And then on the MIT end, many people don't realize that MIT was actually the first organization to receive a contract for the Apollo program. And the results of that contract led to what we know today as being the field of software engineering and computer science. So that contract was aimed at developing the Apollo guidance computer, which is shown in that bottom image there. And the challenge at the time was computers back then were about the size of a room, and you had to shrink that into a 1 cubic foot box, fit it on a spacecraft, and that computer was to help you navigate. It was your GPS, if you will, on your way to the moon. And so if you look in the middle of that middle image there, you'll see a display and a keyboard. That's the computer on the instrument console of the Apollo spacecraft. On the top left-hand corner is the head of this project, Dr. Charles Draper, and he actually tested this system on the roof of one of the buildings at MIT, so you'll notice the Boston skyline in the background if you've ever been. And in the top right is an image of Margaret Hamilton. She's the mother of software engineering. The term software did not exist back then. She came up with the term software, and she led the software development program for the Apollo guidance computer. And right there, she's standing next to the code that was loaded into the computer that helped guide us to the moon. So through all these threads, VR relies on the foundation of software engineering. These organizations have come together again in this modern era, and other organizations like Nvidia have become involved, and we're developing the 21st century media experience. Whereas it used to be in animation, now it's online and it's virtual reality, and I'm really excited to be a part of this. So let's fast track towards today. We have the low Earth orbiting space station that von Braun envisioned 5 decades ago. It's been operating above us for the last 15 plus years, and today it's actually the law of this land that this country's space agency pursue an exploration program which aims to expand permanent human presence beyond Earth orbit, beginning with the crewed exploration of the planet Mars. And so that brings us all back to the Mars 2030 vision. We're trying to develop an environment where anyone can feel like an astronaut walking on the surface of Mars. And so I want to talk briefly about kind of the research that we do at MIT that informs kind of what you see. And it's contributing to a larger research goal across the country's research agencies, NASA, and so on and so forth. So when you're typically exploring your environment, you want to go through, you typically go through a few phases of exploration. You'll go through a flyby type of mission where you just visit there temporarily, a sortie mission where you spend a few days to a few weeks at that destination, long duration, and then you go through sustained presence. So I call this image sort of like the family portrait of our space habitation systems. We've done this in Earth orbit, and we've done it very well. On the moon, between 1969 and 1972, we were able to do a subset of those missions. And Mars has been a little bit lonely of human presence, but we're hoping to change that in the near future. However, we have sent our ambassadors there, robotic ambassadors. So we have orbiters, rovers. Right now, there are actually 5 satellites orbiting Mars. One just got launched last week, and will join that. It will be the 6th one by the Europeans. And what we've learned as we've transitioned through each of these exploration modes, if you will, is that the challenge gets more difficult. So initially, during flyby and sortie missions, we want to prove that we can transport people to that environment. In sortie and long-duration missions, we want to prove that we can develop habitation systems that sustain people in that environment, in addition to transporting them. And then as we transition to sustained presence, where you've always got a human there, and you might switch out your crew every now and then, we've learned that logistics has become a really big problem. And so we've needed a fleet of vehicles to supply these logistics to keep the station running and the people alive. So these include food, water, spare parts for all your technologies, science experiments, etc. And so if you look at this for Mars, we again transition through these phases. You go from flyby, and our ultimate goal is sustained presence. However, the durations that are driven by the distances between Earth and Mars mean that these periods are a lot longer. So sortie and long duration kind of become synonymous in this context. But we've been developing concepts for these over a number of years, and these concepts have evolved as we've learned more about the environment. So we've come up with flyby concepts, sortie/long duration concepts, and more recently sustained presence concepts, where we're really interested in investing a lot of infrastructure in a particular site on Mars. And this is kind of the environment that you'll be walking within when you're playing the Mars 2030 VR experience. It's this final sustained presence goal. Within the research community, we're doing analyses where we're trying to understand what do we actually need on the surface to keep people alive for a certain period of time. And when we figure out what that is, it tells us how big it is, how they're laid out, so what's the size of your modules, what's your outpost site look like, how much stuff do you actually need. And these are the kind of pieces of information that feed into the VR experience. So really briefly, these are the key questions that we look at MIT. I'm just going to flick through these next slides really fast to give you kind of a sense of what we do. The way we accomplish these questions, what technologies and how do we develop them, we develop mathematical models of each of the technologies, and then we make sure that they work by testing them against flight hardware, and then we run different simulations of different scenarios. So just as an example, on the International Space Station, we can model the oxygen generation system. The figure on the right there shows a comparison showing a good correlation between our models and actual flight data from the International Space Station. And on the bottom is some correlation data for plant growth chambers. So in the long term, you might want to grow food on Mars to feed yourself. And that's an experiment that's currently going on board the International Space Station, and there's quite a bit of research going on in that around the agency. We can also predict the spares parts requirements, which, as I mentioned earlier, as you go further away from Earth and you want to stay there for longer, you need more spare parts to keep your systems running. And basically, we combine all these mathematical models together, and then we do what we call like an all-up mission evaluation. So we'll do these analyses for different types of missions, and then we'll figure out what technologies we need, how much of it we need, so how much food, gases, water, what systems we might be able to use to extract those resources from the local environment. And that's kind of the data that we would feed to Julian and his team about, is this module too big, too small? Is this piece of hardware too close to the hub? What are the restrictions around it? And so the state-of-the-art kind of research results are being fed directly into the experience. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Pat.
Thank you, Sydney. So I have 10 minutes to tell you why we're working with Fusion on this project, why we are going to Mars, and how we're going to go to Mars. So I'm going to cut the why we're going to Mars because Sydney did a very good job of saying it's been our policy. But I want to expand on it, though, because the why changes how we do it. So back before 2010, the why we go to Mars was exploration. Now that the why is extending human presence, it changes how we think about Mars, it changes how we approach going to Mars, and it changes the time horizon on how we go to Mars. So first of all, Mars is really hard. It has an atmosphere that is so thin, parachutes don't work well, but it's thick enough that it heats up the spacecraft. It has 1/3 gravity of Earth, which is good because it allows you to use, yes, propulsion fuel coming down, but it's just enough that if you wanted to use rockets all the way down, it would be ridiculous. It takes a long time to get there, years, as Sydney said. Our experience base in space is 1 year. We have never sent people on 3-year missions to space before. The humans react differently to the environment. They start losing weight. They have neurological problems. We're worried about radiation. We have to solve those problems and understand them before we can go to Mars. So a lot of work's to be done in the meantime to answer those questions. Mars is far away, very energy intensive. A lot of reasons Mars is harder than going to the moon. So this is why we haven't just hopped up and gone to Mars. Major challenges. So in order to address those challenges, the way we're looking at going to Mars now is what we call this Evolvable Mars campaign. There's a series of steps and gates we go through to understand if we're ready to go to the next step. So the first gate we've been working on for the past 20 years or so, that's the International Space Station. And that's a perfect laboratory for expanding and understanding the limits of people in space. So we can't move off from the International Space Station until we answer the question, how can humans live and operate in deep space for 1,000 days or more? We don't know the answer to that question yet, but that's how long a Mars mission takes. Once we've answered that question, we understand the limits of humanity and how much we have to adapt the systems to take care of them. We have to do with this next step we call the proving ground. And this is where we start asking the question, now we're in a more Mars environment, we're in deep space, beyond at the edge of the Earth-Moon gravity well. These systems that are sized for human beings, can they go months and years in between use? Can we, as Sydney talked about, get to a point where we don't have to bring up a bunch of spare parts and repairmen to keep it going? So we have to answer that question. We're not really doing that on the International Space Station right now because it's permanently crewed. So we're going to have a little stop off in what we call cislunar space. That's the area around the Earth and Moon gravity well. To do these experiments because they're very reachable by the new SLS and Orion and some international launch vehicles. And that's also a big leap in investment because the SLS itself and the Orion are on the same level of magnitude investment as the International Space Station was. The next step beyond that is investing in long-term habitation and in-space propulsion. And that answers the questions, can we travel to Mars orbit with humans safely and return them? So the next step, we don't go right to the Mars surface, we go to Mars orbit first. Once we've established we can do that safely, we can do that well, then the next big question is, can we get them through that perilous Mars atmosphere to the surface and then return them safely from the surface? On Earth, we have the Kennedy Space Center with thousands of people building and operating and maintaining rockets. On Mars, it's going to be 4 people, maybe a couple of robots, and it's going to be sitting there over a year before you use it. I wouldn't go out and get in my car and expect to drive it after letting it sit in the driveway for a year and a half or so. So we have to address those challenges. So incremental, stepwise. Now, so we're coming up with a series of new classes of spaceships and things. 6 years ago, when our mission to Mars was exploration and science, we had something that looked like this, a nuclear thermal rocket. These are all to scale with each other. This was launched up on several heavy lift launch vehicles. It had a nuclear thermal engine, it had hydrogen fuel tanks, it had 6 crew. It was very Apollo-like in nature. It was all up, everything all at once, drive to the surface of Mars, explore, come back, throw everything away except for the crew and the samples you return. That's not what we call sustainable. So we've been looking at, with this Evolvable Mars campaign, looking at different systems where we have partial usability using propellants that could be manufactured in space, and then using high-power solar retropropulsion and current propulsion technology with a fully reusable spaceship. So this is the first time for a Mars construct we have had a fully reusable spaceship, all the way from the Earth-Moon sphere of influence to Mars sphere of influence and back. And sphere of influence is important. It's like the hubs between cities and airports. But you have to get to the hub first. So we have something called taxis. These are smaller class of spaceships that take you from Earth to the Mars transport spacecraft and from the surface of Mars to the Mars transport spacecraft. And so right now we're working on Orion. That's the Earth to cislunar space vehicle. That's got to be able to accommodate a crew of 4 and take them back and forth to this spaceship that we talked about. From the Mars surface, we have the descent vehicle and the ascent vehicle. They go up and down out of those gravity wells and meet the Mars spaceship. If we were going to the moon, we had the Altair lander that we did 5 or 6 years ago for the lunar program. And then intermediate is something we're calling this Phobos exploration vehicle. Because, as I said, we're not going directly to the Mars surface. We're stopping Mars orbit first. And Mars has 2 incredibly intriguing, unexplored moons, Phobos and Deimos. They're very much like asteroids, and there's so little gravity that you can actually hop around the surface. That's why it has those long, skinny legs on it. But when we talk about going from a sphere of influence to sphere of influence, from the Earth region to the Mars region, there are spaceports involved. Right now, you can look at the International Space Station as a large low Earth orbit spaceport, although we don't plan on going in and out of that. We're actually going to deploy a much smaller initial cislunar habitat out beyond the moon in orbit. And it's going to be like a waypoint where the space station will dock, get refueled and retanked, and the crew will meet it and go back out to Mars again. Now, this is the fun part, because what you're going to see in the Mars 2030 experience is what happens on the surface of Mars. And there's all sorts of opportunity for building it out to what happens before and after Mars, too. But this is where we started when Julian said, hey, I want to understand what's going on at Mars. Part of the reason that NASA really wanted to work this with them is that only 1 out of 1 billion people is going to be able to go to Mars in our lifetimes, basically. Maybe 2 out of 1 billion. We all deserve more than that. We should be able to go along for the ride. So virtual reality is a way of doing that. So we bring the data back. We allow people to be with the crew in situ, but virtually. And so it allows us all to experience what it's like to be an explorer and an astronaut without all the risk, which is sort of pretty cool. So you're going to see some of these in the upcoming thing. Now, what I'm going to do here is going to show a little video. I don't know if this will work or not, because we were having problems with it. You know, we can send people to the moon, but we can't get a video to work in PowerPoint. And I've been working for NASA 30 years, and ever since PowerPoint's been created, that's been a problem. Any Microsoft guys here? All right. So in doing engineering, we do a lot of things where we take 3D models and we use them. Like the first you just saw was how we fit in the rocket shroud. Here's how will we test a vehicle like this Phobos vehicle on a large test stand. What you're seeing right here is called a gantry. That was used for the original Apollo program for the landers. Everything you saw in there was fake. We were just seeing if it fit or not. Here's the rover. You just saw how it worked with the things on Mars. This is just a walk around of what spacecraft could look like for scale. And then we do a lot of things engineering the interior layouts of the systems, both the habitat and the modules, because I've told you we've moved on to the solar electric power. And it's very important in that this new solar electric power is a key enabler to all these future architectures because it's very efficient. Now what you're seeing is this is the NASA version of what the habitats and stuff might look like. It's never going to be that clean, I'll tell you right now. And there's a plant growth chamber. And then this sort of ends off with these large robotic rovers driving off into the sunset on Mars. But the point I wanted to make is that what you saw there, what NASA does with these animations, is that we use it for engineering, and we use it to engage folks. But the screenshots you saw in there, each second of rendering on that, each frame of rendering could take up to an hour or two. And what you're going to see in this Mars 2030 thing is that they're doing 90 frames per second. Much more beautiful, much more breathtaking. And that helps get the experience. So it's a natural fit. We develop the models, we hand it to them, they simplify them, but they put them in a much more breathtaking, realistic environment. And we both win, and everyone gets to go to Mars. So with that, I just wanted to point out that what we're seeing here is a fusion between fusion, I use that word. Fusion between technology, art, and engineering. So the example on the left, we just recently had a visiting artist at the Norfolk Chrysler Museum. My time is done. He came and we showed him that picture of the Phobos exploration vehicle, and then 6 hours later, he built a glass sculpture representing it. And that's going to go on tour in about 6 months from now. And then we have folks building art, just art for the sake of art, being inspired by the exploration. So there's a poster of that reusable vehicle, sort of a retro steampunk look, but it's all good. Everyone benefits from it. So I'm very proud to be part of this adventure. Next.
Thank you. You know, I'm sitting here listening to Pat and Sydney covering all the challenges involved in going to Mars. First of all, I must admit it's a lot more difficult and complicated than I thought. I was supposed to sit here to tell you that VR is difficult, so now I may need to change my agenda, you know. So why build this experience in VR? That's the first question. You know, based on what we're seeing today in the VR industry, it's very clear that VR is going to be pervasive. It's going to touch our lives in many different ways. Use cases will range from education, sports, training, medical, gaming, obviously, social, you name it. So, you know, those of you who tried VR, especially those of you who tried VR for the first time, know how sensational this experience is. You know, looking at people here, the smiles on your faces, I know that many of you have tried VR. But, you know, the sense of presence, the feeling that you're being teleported into a different reality is something that you cannot really explain in words. You need to try it out to even start comprehending the potential of this technology and how this is going to change our lives in a big way. Out of all the use cases that we see today in VR, the one that really excites me the most is the ability to travel to different places on this planet and outside this planet without physically being there. And it feels real. It feels really close to reality. Many applications use a technology that's called photogrammetry, basically using high-resolution pictures from the destination to create beautifully rendered scenes. Nvidia worked with a developer on an Everest-type application. The developer is Solfar, basically using high-resolution pictures from the Everest to create a great experience. But we don't have many high-resolution pictures from Mars, so we have to take it to a whole new different levels. So what do we do here? First of all, Fusion Media partnered with some of the smartest studio guys in this industry, people who have a lot of experience building AAA games. One of them is sitting next to me.
Thanks.
And their decision from the get-go was to build a true-to-life experience. Okay? It has to be real. It has to be different than what we are seeing today. It's being it's with the highest regard to scientific accuracy. Okay? So what you will see in the experience from rocks, terrain, gravity model, lighting models, it's all close to reality. Okay? All the equipment on Mars, like from the rover to the different stations, are based on actual CAD models provided from NASA. Okay? So when you're into this VR experience, you're supposed to feel as if you're in Mars. That's our goal here. Okay? This is something that has never been done before. It sets a very high standard for VR. So what does it take to build this experience, right? It takes a lot of scientific research, a lot of scientific data that has been collected over the years from some of the smartest people on Earth. It takes visionaries like Julian just to kick off this project, initiate it, pull the right people and make it a reality. And it also takes the latest and greatest graphics technology, state-of-the-art graphics technology to enable this whole experience. So building a great VR experience is actually difficult. Okay? There are a few elements that need to be in place to achieve the sense of presence. You need great HMDs, great optics, you need a wide field of view, you need a rock-solid tracking system with less than that sub-millimeter in accuracy. You need a resolution that's good enough. But from a graphics standpoint, above all, you need to run this application at 90 frames per second at the latency that's not greater than 20 milliseconds. And the idea is that the frame rate has to keep up with your eye and head movement. Okay, slight mismatch between what you see and what your vestibular system reports will cause motion sickness. Okay, so 90 frames per second and 20 milliseconds between head movement to display is a hard requirement. So what do most game developers, application developers do to meet this requirement? They compromise. They compromise on the resolution, they compromise on the visual quality and the fidelity, on textures, on geometry, just to fit within this, VR requirement. But these are not the type of compromises that we're willing to make here for Mars 2030. When Julian reached out to us, I think that the first thing that he brought up is that, yeah, we want to go big, but performance is going to be a big problem. It is a big problem, but it's a problem that Nvidia is well positioned to solve. So from the very beginning, we've been working with the studio guys, with Julian and his team to incorporate the latest and greatest rendering technique, the most innovative rendering techniques, apply optimizations, and provide all the horsepower needed to drive this type of experience. So this type of experience is not going to be the experience that you see today on the HMDs that are available today. We're supposed to take it to a whole new, different level. This slide illustrates the delta in performance requirement between the typical gaming case. Our GPUs were built to drive 3D games and VR. So on a typical gaming case, you want to run the game at least 30 frames per second. We recommend obviously 45 or 60, but at 30 frames per second, some of the games will be playable. So on a typical, the most common resolution out there, 1080p, the GPU has to drive 60 megapixels per second. Virtual reality, you need to render to 2 screens. The resolution today on the HMD is 1200 by 1080, but you need to render to a higher resolution before you apply a warp. And you need to render it at 90 frames per second. Okay? That basically adds to 450 megapixels per second. So the key takeaway from the slide is that to do VR, it takes 7 times the horsepower that it takes to run a 3D game, right, on a PC. So if you think of NVIDIA strategy, our strategy is based on 3 elements. First of all is the best-in-class hardware. Second is the best-in-class software. And the third one is the SDK. We cannot address all the challenges in VR ourselves. We have to work with the ecosystem partners. So at NVIDIA, we're absolutely committed to working with all the ecosystem partners to address the biggest challenges in VR. And those ecosystem partners include the capture and streaming guys, the headset, Oculus, HTC, and others, platform stores, engines. We will be using the Unreal Engine 4 for Mars 2030. It's one of the most powerful engines out there, one of the most popular engines for AAA games. And that was the first engine to incorporate NVIDIA's multi-ray shading, VRSLI, the most innovative technique. So we're going to get a lot of performance and great visual quality out of this engine. And as I said, our SDK is basically our way to engage the ecosystem partners, allow the ecosystem partners to tap into all the goodness that we deliver in our hardware and software. These are some of the features that are part of our SDK that will be enabled in the Mars 2030 experience. On the top left, you can see the multi-ray shading. It's a new innovative technique. VRSLI is the ability to do VR with 2 cards by assigning 1 card for each eye. This will improve performance significantly. The features have already been integrated in Unreal Engine 4 and will be used for the Mars 2030. Other features will be used by the HMD makers, Oculus and HTC on the Rift and the Vive, and the purpose here is to reduce latency as much as possible, right? To enable the best VR experience, and the other features are for content creation, not necessarily for Mars 2030, but I just wanted to have them on the slide for completion. It's mostly for the workstation and the enterprise space. That's pretty much it. If you want to learn more about NVIDIA's latest and greatest rendering techniques, advancement in VR, you're more than welcome to join our a GPU technology conference that's going to take place in San Jose Convention Center between April 4th and April 7th. And at GDC, you will be able to experience Mars 2030 in VR. Okay, so that's a very good reason to come and join us at GDC. That's pretty much it. With that, I'll hand it over to Justin.
All right. Thank you. So we've got all this fantastic equipment and ideas and data from NASA. We've got the support of NVIDIA, and now we actually need to get it into a game engine and get it interactive so that people can walk around and play. And I'm going to be talking about a few of the challenges that were involved in, doing that. So obviously, we want to start with real data from Mars. Conveniently, as Sydney pointed out, we have a few satellites in orbit constantly scanning the surface as they go, and delivering us, I think, something like 260 terabytes worth of data now just from like the Mars Recon Orbiter. The best source of high-resolution data comes from the Mars Recon Orbiter's HiRISE camera. It's this massive 130-pound, $40 million camera currently in orbit around Mars that is getting us 1 pixel for every 30 centimeters on Mars. So every single foot, we've got a sample point. That's imagery, that's not elevation data. So what we do is anytime there's 2 passes over an area, we can stereoscopically infer the height from that and get really accurate within a foot vertically data as far as like what the elevation at that point is. So the first real challenge is finding areas where we have a bunch of contiguous strips of data that has been processed by the University of Arizona, and then also that has visually interesting features, things that pop, plateaus and craters and things that you would actually be interested in walking on, or that look cool when you're driving around on them. And then for the backgrounds, we need much broader swaths of data. And fortunately, the European Space Agency's Mars Express Orbiter has a stereo camera, like it's actually built for this, that is not as high res, but gets us massive coverage on Mars at 50 meters. Each pixel is 50 meters of data, is 50 meters of terrain. So once we've downloaded all those data sets, and anyone here can grab them, you can go on to the FTPs at University of Berlin, University of Arizona, a couple other places, and just download them yourselves if you're interested. We have to actually get that data into one, block. And it's actually a little bit tricky because of spherical projection. They're not mapping a flat surface with the satellites, they're mapping a sphere. So all the data that's coming in is actually distorted because it's spherically projected. And because sometimes it's a little bit off or the altitude's a little bit different, that spherical projection isn't consistent between passes. So you're sitting there in Photoshop basically like, okay, I've got this crater lined up, but this other crater is like totally separate, and you're like skewing each pass slightly until it's lined up. And it's actually as much art as science at that point, where you're just trying to get all the data sets to resolve into one coherent 8 kilometer by 8 kilometer height map that's, 1 meter resolution and accurate to within 30 centimeters. And that is basically the foreground that you walk on and drive on and play around in Mars 2030. So, yep. And right around there, you can see you actually have craters and plateaus overlooking. That's actually visually interesting features. That's something that more than just flat terrain, you'd actually want to play around on. So we import it into the engine, draw a big box around it, make sure that it's the right size, and also look at the satellite data, what's the highest point, what's the lowest point, and make sure that it actually matches up so that what you're dealing with is the real size of the object. Then you also take the backgrounds from the European Space Agency, knit all 26 of those strips together, composite that into one level, and boom, you've got 8 kilometers by 8 kilometers of playable terrain and about 500 kilometers in any direction of background scenery. That is actual locations on Mars, actual terrain on Mars. This exists. The next challenge is color, because nobody's actually stood on Mars. Nobody can tell us exactly what it actually looks like. And the kicker is 85% of all the images you've seen of Mars are not actually tuned. They're not attempting to be the color that you'd see if you stood there. Generally, they fall into the first category or the third category there, where it's either just raw data straight off of the CCD on the camera, or it's balanced for Earth lighting. This isn't to make it more natural for the audiences, although that doesn't hurt. It's actually because the scientists find it useful to have the blue channel blown out because they can pick out details, which is really useful if you're trying to steer the rover around rocks. But the end result is that only about 15% of the images that you find out there are actually balanced to look the way they would if you were standing on Mars. So, So it's really good for picking out details, but getting the stuff that actually looks like you're standing there takes some digging. And we will use images like this, and when we're making the texture for a rock, we'll be like, okay, we can color match it to this rock in this image. If it's sand, we can color match it to that sand. And we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that our overall looks just like the photos that have been properly color balanced for the human eye. And one other neat thing is, because the atmosphere is so thin, the way Rayleigh scattering works is quite different than Earth. As a matter of fact, it's basically the opposite. The sky is golden, almost butterscotch colored at noon, and then during sunset, because the sun is passing through so much more atmosphere because it's coming in at a low angle, it starts to get closer to Earth. So sunsets are blue, and high noon is yellow. So that's quite a bit different. And then another challenge has been the rover, because the rover doesn't work like any vehicle you've ever driven. We actually got a chance to go to JSC and drive the rover, which was awesome, and we're very grateful to NASA for that. But most vehicles are 4 wheels, 2 of which pivot, and power comes on instantly. And that pretty much every vehicle physics package assumes at the code level that that is how vehicles in your game want to work, except that's not the case here. We have 6 wheels that can spin 360 degrees. The entire rover can spin in place. It can just suddenly shift to the side. It can shift to the side while turning. So you can do all these complex movements in the rover that you can't do with a real car. And most physics packages aren't prepared to deal with that. So that gets a little bit interesting. And then the other thing that we found is, like, when dealing with NASA's assets, and this was referred to earlier, we're basically looking at what are CAD models with incredibly high poly counts, but also built for incredibly detailed physics simulation. NASA's doing 50,000 or more physical surfaces, like full contact modeling in real time with massive banks of GPUs running CUDA. It's kind of insane. Meanwhile, in gaming, if you have more than 26 collision planes on your model, your technical artist is going to come and start yelling at you. Like, yeah. So they are way ahead of the curve on that. And the other really weird thing I found, when I was first implementing the rover, I was actually going in and starting to change things out. And I left the dune buggy physics, like, as a vestigial remnant in there by accident. And so I'm driving the rover around, and I'm actually, without realizing it, dragging the dune buggy around underneath and behind me. The worst part is, it actually feels right. Having driven the rover, having driven the simulator, it's like, wait a minute, this is actually how it feels. So this led to a really awkward conversation with the wheel animation and physics programmer, Scott, where it was basically like, okay, so we obviously need this fixed, but we need it to feel the same way after it's been fixed. So yeah, and that sort of speaks to our, I guess, our commitment to, when it comes to terrain, when it comes to color, and when it comes to, like, the actual physics and feel of being there, just creating an experience that is like actually standing on Mars and actually driving on Mars. That's, yeah, so we're doing a lot of different things to make that happen. All right, and I think that's it for me. Julian?
Yeah. Is that what's next?
Okay. So, all right, in the following slide, we have a little kind of trailer for you guys to see of the whole experience. I'm hoping that the audio works. Well, yeah, that was pretty short, but yeah, at least you guys got a chance to see. Once at GTC, we'll be able to kind of show you guys in VR what it's like, and you guys will get a chance to drive the rover yourselves and go on a mission. So. Oh, yeah, so I don't know if you wanted to open it up for questions from you guys. Go for it.
Ahoy, top of the morning, everyone. First and foremost, thank you very much for making the time and putting this together for us today and leading us into the future. I would like to offer my services and offer my body up to science, if you will. You guys mentioned that a few of you are gamers, some sorts, like there's some interactive gamers in the house. Are any of you familiar with Red Dead Redemption?
Yep.
Of course.
Yep.
So if I were to tell you,
I woke up with my head between a pair of tits and it seemed rude not to get very painted with.
I'm the voiceover and motion capture guy for that, and since the founding father of motion capture and circus has taken up space in the Lucasfilm range, I would love to offer my services for whatever you guys need to accomplish to make this whole plan happen. I'm your voiceover and motion capture guy right here.
Awesome.
Any other questions?
What kind of budget realistically is it going to take to get to Mars? Because it seems to be something that it might take more than just NASA itself, but more of a global effort to make it a reality sooner. Just I'm ballpark thinking.
All right, so I knew someone was going to ask that question because they always do. So there's how NASA has done missions in the past, and there's how we're going to need to do them in the future in order for the stuff to be affordable. There's enough budget in the United States of America to do all this if we wanted to make it a priority. There's enough budget in the world to do this if we wanted to make it a priority. There's enough existing budget to make it happen if we were more focused and didn't spread the wealth so much. So there's a combination of reprioritization and partnering, like we're doing here with the commercial industry too, because they're getting good stuff out of it and we're getting good stuff out of it. And if you can have win-win scenarios with commercial folks, with industry, and with the internationals, there's a good chance. Now, when they say Mars 2030, that doesn't mean we're there in 2030. That's where we're lined up at the start line and we're ready to go.
Oh.
Okay, so now this is like more visual experience of going to Mars. Are you guys thinking how to make it a truly sort of multi-sensory experience, or like really, how can we feel with our whole body? Simpler people.
Well, there were a lot of, we're discussing a lot of ways to kind of have this multi-sensory experience. It's pretty open-ended now, but I think there was a conversation that we were having about there's sand here on Earth that replicates Martian sand, and we wanted to maybe have something where someone could walk on this type of sand while having the headset on, and feel like they're walking on Mars, if that's what you're referring to. But the experience itself is interactive, so you are the astronaut and you are going on missions. So it's not just a visual experience. And in regards to the audio, we've taken a lot of care in getting it the most accurate as possible, and we've set up with our team at JSC, we set up multi-directional microphones to capture the most accurate complementary audio for VR. And also, and one more thing to the multi-sensory thing, is that for the music, we're recording with the Prague Symphonic to kind of accompany it. So there is that intent to go multi-sensory with it.
I mean, ultimately, we're limited to the hardware that's available. I mean, if HTC, Vive, and Oculus, and whoever release equipment that allows users to interact more fully, then we will be able to take advantage of that. But as a software product, we are naturally limited to the hardware that's available to both us and to the public at large. So the answer to that question is, we will take advantage of whatever we can get our hands on when we can get our hands on it. And yeah.
This is
So in NASA, we have a facility called Argos. It's basically a tether that makes you weigh like you're on the moon or you're on Mars. And we're talking about merging that with virtual reality so they get the whole walking motion thing going down. Now, I imagine some very innovative people in this room could take a Raspberry Pi and a couple of actuators, hang it from your ceiling, hook it up to this thing, and you could be bouncing like you're on Mars. It doesn't take a lot.
This is just a starting point. VR technology will continue to evolve. Keep in mind that the HMDs are even not available on the market today, right? And it will evolve really, really fast. So by the time we get to Mars, you're gonna you're going to experience great VR.
So I'm interested in what you're going to be doing with other aspects of the Mars mission. For example, when can I grow potatoes? When can I walk around in that spider-like rover creature?
Yeah, so we are building out a veggie unit, which is kind of a prototype that NASA is working on to grow food on Mars. So you will have kind of a walkthrough in that. So to answer your first question, and then the second one was, I'm sorry.
Rover.
The rover. Well, that's for a Phobos mission, the one that you saw with the. I don't know if Pat wants to elaborate a little bit on that rover because it's really cool.
So they're working on the surface right now, which has that same rover body, but it's on wheels. When you're, to me, an expansion pack would be Phobos. I'm just saying. Go ahead.
I'm not optimistic that humans will survive a long-term space environment. I mean, absolutely no. The first astronauts that went into space died very quickly with lots of bad illnesses.
I'm surprised you're saying that because. Have you met Buzz Aldrin lately?
To me, it seems like it's an area where we're really forward on science, we're really confident. And I'm just not optimistic that the first people go there might then constitute them. Maybe that's a choice these astronauts all make, but and maybe not the guys can answer that, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of talk about or understanding about that piece. We do a lot of evolution protect.
So that piece is what we're using the International Space Station for, to get that exposure. Again, we just had one guy come down after being a year, just 1 year. That's the longest. I would love to see 3 years up there before we actually commit a crew to Mars. But space station is supposed to be transitioned in 2024 or 2028 or something like that. So we're running up 1/3 of that of Earth. Yes, ma'am.
If we're not going to the conference in April, what's the distribution where we can experience this?
Well, in April, we're going to kind of present that demo and make it public to everybody. And then we're exploring kind of where we're going to place it. We also want to get to kind of every platform. But yeah, I mean, to answer that question, we're aiming at the Steam marketplace to be able to kind of put this up there. Come, yeah, awesome.
Sir.
I mean, definitely, Pat's got me thinking about Phobos at the moment.
One planet at a time.
Certainly, we have a lot of good data on the moon, and the international partners are really focused on the moon right now. I couldn't see it being difficult to take this and eventually have a moon expansion pack, We want to go to the whole solar system, not just Mars, my personal preference.
It's very fortunate for us that right as VR is starting to seriously kick off as a technology, we also have NASA and the ESA just pouring buckets of landscape data from Mars. So partly I think the emphasis is driven by the richness of the data available to us, which at the moment VR is booming, happens to be Mars.
All right. I see no more other questions. Going once, twice sold. Okay.